You said this morning, welcome, you said this morning that your pupils should be proud of their achievement and have full confidence in the results. I want to know how you know that. I mean, you presented in your document in advance of the committee that the results this year can't be compared with previous years, but then go on to give confidence in the system by using those exact results. I wonder whether there's a bit of inconsistency there and why you've published those results if people shouldn't draw definitive conclusions from them.
Yeah. Well, what I said in my Chief Examining Officer's report, which is published on Results Day, I'll repeat here because I think it's quite important. I understand the point you're making because you know, we've had a couple of years in which the assessment approach and the approach that we've needed to take in the circumstances has been quite different. But we've all pulled together to ensure that young people get qualifications and their hard work is reflected in those qualifications. So I think that's, you know, I think it's a very important message. It's an important collective message for Scotland that young people have worked hard and that the 137,000 young people who got the results on the 9th of August worked hard and deserved those results. But we do see variation in attainment and the composition of attainment to an extent every year between courses and indeed over time. So every year there will be some differences in the attainment pattern for different reasons. But over the last couple of years we've seen more movements in attainment than we would see in a normal year when exams are held. And there are a number of reasons for that. Disruption to learning would be one, and periods of remote learning. There were also modifications to assessment last year and the absence of external assessment. So it was a different assessment approach. And the flexibility in how courses were considered and assessed by teachers and lecturers required due to the levels of disruption may also have impacted on attainment. So, you know, I think it's very important that we highlight the credibility of the qualifications because we put in place an approach that we felt was the very best approach we could in the circumstances, but we're also acknowledging that there are differences. There have been differences in the way in which young people have been assessed over the last couple of years, and that is reflected in the results. In a sense, in terms of a run of data, there's a discontinuity, but those results are credible. I think it's important that I do highlight the quality assurance process that we undertook. Quality assurance is a really important part of any qualifications which are internally assessed. If you look at the college sector, quality assurance is absolutely central to the work that is done year in, year out to assure students getting an HND in one, for example, in one institution in Scotland can have parity with an HND in another institution in Scotland. So the quality assurance gives additional assurances as suggested that standards have been maintained and across Scotland. And we provided advice to schools on samples of evidence around whether the standard was being adhered to. So a range of approaches were taken, and that includes by schools and colleges themselves.
Can I on that consistency of evidence, because we've had reports from pupils but also teachers about the inconsistency of the evidence that was provided between schools but also between subjects as well. How do you know whether there was a consistency of evidence across the piece? Because, I mean, there is considerable evidence that contradicts that.
So there were some flexibilities in the way in which young people could be assessed, and that was part of the reason why, you know, exams were cancelled, because it was not safe to assess young people in the same way and at the same time in every school and college across Scotland in the way that we have done for the last 130 years. And that was obviously a decision taken by ministers on the basis of public health advice. So therefore, the alternative certification model that needed to be put in place needed to have sufficient flexibility to recognise that disruption was being experienced in a different way in different schools and colleges across Scotland. So there needed to be flexibility in the approach, and that was agreed. However, the NQ group and SQA also agreed that the centrality of demonstrated attainment, that evidence was very important in determining what young people achieved. And we provided guidance, and Jill Stewart, my colleague, can say a little more about that, about what that would constitute.
So was that the only reason for the inconsistency? Was the impact of the pandemic? There wasn't a different application by different teachers in different schools for other reasons? It was all to do with the pandemic that there was inconsistency. Are you sure about that?
So I'd like you to explain what you mean by inconsistency.
Well,
I mean, you were talking a moment ago about the difference between the 2019 results and the 2020 results. Are you now talking about issues between institutions?
You asked teachers and schools
Yes.
to provide evidence of their pupils' performance, but different teachers applied that in different ways in different schools and between different subjects in this last year's set of assessments and qualifications. And you said that was to allow flexibility to cope with the impact of the pandemic. Particular outbreaks in schools, I would imagine, was one of them. Are you sure that's the only reason that the evidence guidance was applied in different ways in different schools?
We provided guidance that we expected schools to follow. Within that guidance, there was some flexibility. I wouldn't describe it as inconsistency. I would describe it as flexibility for the right reasons. Schools and colleges and local authorities, and you heard from local authority representatives last week, provided advice and guidance around local quality assurance to ensure that there was credibility to the evidence that was being produced within that flexibility. And we also undertook quality assurance across every school and college across Scotland. In addition, we undertook lots of understanding standards events so that we could provide as much assurance as possible that schools and colleges were following our guidance to ensure that the qualifications were credible.
Okay, one final question. Okay, it's to do with the moderation process. You were still looking at historical results to question individual performance or class performance.
No, we weren't.
Well, there was pressure put back on. There was feedback provided to schools using historical information.
No.
We had that from...
No, there wasn't.
Well, the directors who were before us last week acknowledged, and so did the EIS acknowledge, that historical performance in a school was used to provide feedback to... So you're denying that completely?
I think you're asking me what SQA... I think you're asking me what SQA did. What SQA did is, for its quality assurance process, was looked at evidence that was provided to... that was requested from schools, and there was no information sought on historical attainment. We looked at the evidence in front of us, and we looked at whether that was to standard. If it was to standard, we provided that feedback. If it was not to standard, we provided that feedback. In addition, for every course across Scotland, we also provided course reports, which would help in ensuring that other schools understood that guidance and were taking account of the feedback. The actions that local authorities and schools took, there was some work done by Education Scotland, by inspectors, and local authorities were very clear with schools that historical attainment could inform a conversation, but would not define results.
But this is your system that you devised together in partnership with others, where historical information was used to provide feedback. But surely that provided a cost for those schools that previously were disadvantaged and provided poorer performance. So,
SQA,
and that pressure was not there.
SQA did not.
Hold on a second, let me just conclude this bit. That pressure was not there on previously better performing schools. So why was it appropriate, even just in an advisory or a feedback loop, why was that ever allowed to happen? Because we surely learnt the lessons from last year. Why was that allowed?
SQA did not look at historic attainment as part of its quality assurance, and did not encourage or request that schools look at historic attainment as part of its quality assurance process. Ministers asked Her Majesty's inspectors to look at the quality assurance process that was in place at a local level, and inspectors did that. And local authority representatives last week highlighted the approach that they took locally to quality assurance. So what I'm seeking to explain to you here is the guidance that we provided to schools and the work that we did. And I can assure you that historic attainment was not part of the approach.
Willie Rennie.
You said from the perspective of the SQA, it didn't have a role. But clearly in the system, historical data did have a role if a question was asked that a pupil or a class was out of line with previous performance. A question was asked. Even if it didn't lead from you to a change in a result, it put pressure on the teacher or the class or the school to question whether the result was right. That never applied to better performing schools where, per se, let's say, a poorly performing pupil was never questioned because they were sticking in with historical performance. So your system, even though you never asked it and you never moderated, the system did, and you allowed that to happen. So it was your system. Surely you should take responsibility for that.
Well, I don't have evidence that happened.
Well, they said it last week. The director said it. The EIS said it. The trade unions were very clear. The questions were asked, and they didn't like it being asked.
But I think the discussions that we had on a number of occasions in the NQ group, including which included the EIS, which included local authorities, around this issue, was that young people, and this is very important, that learners should receive grades on the basis of the evidence in front of teachers. Now, that evidence might be subject to quality assurance. That evidence might be subject to questions from the local authority, or indeed part of cross-marking. A whole range of approaches were put in place around providing assurance of the very consistency issue that you've been very keen to stress. But that results absolutely should be based on the evidence of demonstrated attainment, and that was at the centre of the approach this year.